Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Speak, Film, and Enter, a podcast where we review and rank movies. I'm Nate.
And I'm Dylan.
And I'm Adam.
And today we are talking about Oppenheimer, which you may have heard of. It came out last weekend. Christopher Nolan's latest movie. And Adam, probably pretty self-explanatory, but either way, would you like to tell the people what Oppenheimer is about?
Indeed. The story of American scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer and his role in the development of the atomic bomb in World War II.
All right.
Ooh.
So, I guess coming into this, how much did you guys know about Oppenheimer outside of just that he developed the bomb during World? Like, that was it. That was basically it for me. This is based off a pretty lengthy book and a lot of details about his early life and after the war that I knew absolutely nothing about. So that's how I came into this.
I knew a little bit of, obviously not his personal life, because like who cares? At least like what they teach you in history class. Yeah. what they teach you in history class. Some of the factoids about him. The quote, obviously, and sorry I'm a little bit dark today. It's very bright outside. But you could say there's a bomb going off outside.
Could you?
I probably.
You mean the sun,
that.
Nathan?
I would say, now that we're talking about that, it is a very hot day here, and the room I'm recording in happens to be like the hottest in the whole house. So if I'm sweating profusely by the end of this episode, it's not just because I want to talk about Oppenheimer so bad.
Yeah, no, I knew some of the factoids and obviously his famous quote. That's from Hindu scripture and some of the other stuff. One of the factoids they have in the movie about them taking Kyoto off the map or potential targets. That's a true story. So some of those things. So not a ton, but a little bit.
Yeah, not a ton. Mostly, that he created it and then he, had very, very mixed feelings about it and just kind of very interesting character in American history and really the history of the world. So.
Yeah. Adam, does Dylan sound a little quiet to you, or is that just me?
Might be just you. He sounds pretty good to me.
Okay,
that's fine. I do have headphones on, so it always sounds slightly better.
I've got my AC blasting behind me as well, so that could be a part of it. I got some background noise, but I don't know about you guys, but I pretty much loved this from beginning to end. As I've talked with both you guys about, more Dylan than Adam, but I don't love Christopher Nolan. He's very hit or miss for me. I do love Dunkirk though. And so after seeing Oppenheimer, I'm basically of the opinion now that he should just make historical movies. Usually the parts about Nolan movies that bugs me are when he just gets so kind of up his own ass about like kind of trying to have some kind of plot twist or like puzzle box nature to his story that it just like kind of ignores plot and character for the sake of like solving a puzzle or a riddle or something,
or like pulling off a trick, like a mythical, and device of some kind.
Yeah, and that really just everything about Tenet I did not like, which I know Adam and I strongly disagree on Tenet, but that's for another day. But anyway, Dunkirk coming into this was my favorite Christopher Nolan movie, and Oppenheimer's probably pretty safely number 2 for me now. I think when the story is kind of already laid out for him.
Yeah.
I like what he's able to do with that. Even though with both Dunkirk and Oppenheimer, he does some Nolan-esque things to play with time a little bit. But I found them very effective in Dunkirk, and I found them almost equally as effective with Oppenheimer.
As far as like Nolan himself and his movies go, I think the only one I don't genuinely like love is Interstellar. So
I do really like Interstellar.
Yeah, and I know we're on opposite sides on that. So obviously certain ones of them are, a hit or miss. And the twist in that one I felt was a little bit more like boring.
That's very Nolan-ish and kind of.
Yeah.
That's the side of stuff that Nolan stuff that I don't like.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yes. And I will say some of his normal critiques of like you can't really hear his dialogue come through in this movie. I know there was at least one part when they're doing some testing that Oppenheimer says something and it's only like 3 or 4 word phrase and I just didn't catch what he said and I was like, oh, it sounds kind of like everything's just a little bit muffled and it's like, all right, well you can sort of make out what's happening, but It doesn't suffer as much as say Tenet does from that problem, that specific
For
problem,
sure.
which is nice. It's a nice change of pace.
Nate, I would agree with what you're saying, where I think his style applied to a historical setting and story is very effective, because what he can do with he's so great at like kind of long sequences and montages. And, this is a 3-hour movie, but there were like, it felt like, to me at least, there would be like 10, 15, 20-minute long almost set pieces within the movie where the music is slowly building, and it covers events that take place over weeks and weeks and weeks, or it covers like a conversation that actually needs like 5 minutes to breathe. And so we get that, but we also get like this, like this building, it's that like, it's like, and it's a way of making maybe a stale historical, like, especially like the last hour, where it basically becomes like a courtroom drama. And like, and a lot of people, including myself, didn't see that coming really, just because, like we said, we didn't know a ton about his backstory. But it's effective when Nolan does it, because it makes what might just feel kind of like a really slow part of the movie still have pace and still feel like we're always building to something.
Yeah, I agree with that. I particularly love the way this movie is edited, which isn't something that generally stands out to me too much unless it's like really, really noticeably bad. But the way he was able to kind of weave together, it is 3 different timelines, but the way that it's told really just kind of felt like 2 to me.
Yeah.
And I think that is a testament to how well it's put together. I mean, like, the book, from what I've heard, is just all chronological, and this movie is not. It's bouncing back and forth between 2 different hearings, kind of post-war, and then the build-up just kind of from the beginning of like him being in college, essentially, through when he gets recruited to run the Manhattan Project and all the World War II stuff with the testing there. I just found all that stuff fascinating. I was drawn in right away. And the way that that's stitched together, combined with like these sort of fascinating visions of like doom that sort of play off of like The Wind Rises, the Miyazaki movie from 2013, which we did a review of that I'll link here on our other channel, Exploring Cinema, like about a week ago. Where there's just this kind of conscience that's floating through it, where like he's arrogant and he wants to prove that he can do this and leave his mark on history and in the scientific community.
Yeah.
But he just has this slowly creeping feeling of like, is this right? And I think there are strong elements of just kind of willful denial.
Yeah.
That you see play out here. And I just think all of that comes through so well from the editing, and also just how fantastic Cillian Murphy is.
Yeah, I would agree.
I think Cillian Murphy, I mean, he's worked with Christopher Nolan before, so he probably had a little bit of an inroad, but I think he was the perfect cast for this. It's all about the look. There's a lot of, there'll be crazy visual things going on behind him or interspersed with it, but it's a lot of long shots of Cillian Murphy looking into the camera or near the camera or off into the distance, interspersed with other things. And he just is able to convey so much with just a look, and like somehow kind of give you the feeling of like that inner conflict, and like, I'm probably maybe like going to regret this later, and like maybe what I've done is horrible, and maybe I am like a monster, but also
bury those feelings.
But also maybe I'm a genius war hero who just created one of the greatest discoveries in human history.
And deterrence.
Like, am I both? And and to your point, Dan, I felt like the naivete came in with he thought he could still be able to control it, and kind of he was blindsided by them trying
Matt Damon
push him out afterwards. By Matt Damon and Robert Downey Jr. And that part he was naive, but it's very interesting. I'll tell you this before I go to you, Adam. This definitely launched me down a Manhattan Project rabbit hole, and I watched 2 documentaries later because we saw this at about noon. I watched a documentary right when I got home, and then I watched another one before I went to bed, all about Manhattan Project and atomic bombs. It like totally reinvigorated my interest. So I will give this movie that to it. And that's kind of why I want to see it again. It's just now I'm like really interested in that stuff. And because of Nolan's style, I'd be open to seeing it again, because it didn't feel really long. And to your point, Nate, the editing is very interesting. There's always something to look at, or just like I don't know. It's very well done.
Yeah, I had friends talk about the editing and say that they found it jarring because it's always like going to a different perspective, like somebody else is like talking. So the edits when there's conversations happening, and I actually found that really refreshing because you need to see a bunch of different perspectives, and you need to have like Oppenheimer's clearly the focus of this movie, but he has to have important conversations with so many different people that understand one specific aspect of the project. So compartmentalization is a huge deal when they're talking about the project, and that definitely comes through. And I actually enjoyed that he was like, all right, I'm talking to this person for like what may be like a really just like a quip or a very short conversation, 2 or 3 lines back and forth. And then he goes to somebody else. And they were saying like, oh, it's kind of frantic and they couldn't follow it. And I was like, I kind of like that snappy dialogue, that very Sorkin-esque, like, we got to do this, we got to do that. And it got me into the mood of like, especially when we get to the courtroom stuff, like, hey, like this is really serious and it's smart people doing smart things. Like, it's very high level in that regard. And I really liked that it was a quick edit or like a snap here, a snap there. And then it lingered for a little bit on a shot and then would switch. Especially like the shots, the close-ups of Killian's face, like you were saying, you can see all that inner turmoil. You can see him having the ethical conversation with himself and going, I have to do this because if I don't, like the quote is like the Nazi, I can't trust the Nazis with it. So like, I have to do it. So he knows whatever he creates is going to be awful and terrible, but it's also going to be great. And, he'll, whether he wants to be regarded this way or not, he will go down in history as like the father of the A-bomb. And his poor performance is just absolutely, he's at his peak.
How did you feel about, I guess, the balance of like his personal life with the kind of story of the A-bomb? Because I agree with you, Nate. I felt like everything about where they were just showing us like the Manhattan Project or what life was like at Los Alamos, or them just talking about like, we're going to do this, or the Germans just did that. Like I was totally glued. So did you also feel that with like the personal story stuff? Like Florence Pugh makes an appearance, a brief appearance, kind of. I mean, I guess, how do you feel like that was pulled off? Especially since we just saw a Miyazaki film where it was very deeply personal.
Yeah. I was actually really fascinated by that stuff because kind of my point earlier where like all I really knew about him was the Manhattan Project. And while it's fun to see sort of like the process of that and how it all came together and watch these like brilliant minds try to figure this out, I also found it really interesting to just kind of dive deeper into the person. And that's where I think, like with the trailers and just kind of what he's famous for, it's really easy to go into this movie just expecting like 3 hours of the Manhattan Project. But like Christopher Nolan does a great job to kind of honor the fact that this is a biopic about Oppenheimer and not about the Manhattan Project. He just led that, and it's a big part of who he was. But there's all this other stuff about the man other than that project that I found really interesting. Particularly, there's so many conversations about communism in this movie, which I found fascinating because I generally just associate all the Red Scare stuff with post-World War II. I mean, obviously there had to be some stuff going on before it, but just kind of the way you sort of compartmentalize things in history of like this happened, then this happened. It's easy to kind of forget that like a lot of these things were happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Or as this was happening, this thing was starting to build and the seeds were being planted. I found that to be really interesting. I really enjoyed the courtroom stuff in sort of the last third or like 45 minutes of the movie. I did find it jarring at first.
Me too.
Because I didn't expect it, and I can see that bothering some people. One great thing we got from it, though, is that it did give us an amazing Emily Blunt scene to just remind everybody how incredible of an actress she is.
Yeah.
But once I kind of figured out what it was doing, I really liked it. But I do think there is an element of kind of the stakes feel lower.
Yeah.
So you can kind of think like how much of this movie is actually left. And that can throw some people. But I think anytime a movie's 3 hours long and I leave it and kind of think I want to see this again in the theater, that's just insanely impressive.
Yeah, I like your point, Nate, because I felt like the energy in the theater after it, when it gets to that back 45, and it's all about just how they kind of took it away from him, and it is very courtroom, you could feel the energy in the theater kind of change. And I felt like some people maybe did start to lose it.
Like, a buddy of ours fell asleep for like 20 minutes.
I know, yeah.
What?
But for me, at least, there was a payoff to it.
And,
right. And then it ends in a way, to your point, that really makes me want to see it again, and a really very brief kind of scene to him kind of later in his life that I thought was really effective too. Like he kind of puts on the makeup and he's like old Oppenheimer. There's only like one scene, but I thought that scene was really well done. Yeah, it's very interesting. I just think that maybe that is throwing some people off because they don't see it coming. And the trailers, let's be honest, 50% of the trailer is explosions. And
yeah,
a lot of this movie, almost all of it is not. So,
yeah. Well, this is
all the explosions legacy. Are in the trailer.
Yeah.
This isn't just the story of him making the bomb. It's his whole legacy. I mean, like, that's obviously a large part of it, but it's how do you feel after, and what did they do to him after? What did the United States government attempt to do, or certain people within the government? Like, no matter how great you are, they will try to take everything from you and discredit you so that you don't get a chance to say, hey, I made this horrible thing and I think we should think about it. And they're like, we don't care.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. And I think it ends also on a very kind of tying it to the present in a way. Like, hey, kind of a wake up call to a lot of people. Like, these weapons are still out there. There's a lot of them. Like, we're,
also a nice
what he was afraid of is very much like mostly our reality, to a point.
Well, and look at how the A-bomb changed the world. Like, AI is about to do the same thing. We're on another like precipice of a like defining technology. I think you can pull that in as well. At least I did. And what's that going to look like? So,
anything else, or should we jump into the stars?
Before we get to the stars, I guess just any others. The cast, pretty big cast. Any performance that really stood out? I wanted to shout out Robert Downey Jr., who I thought did a really good job not being Iron Man, not being Tony Stark.
See, I saw a lot of Tony Stark in him, in especially in the later scenes in the courtroom stuff. I saw a lot of him getting back into the character almost of Tony.
I didn't see that at all.
No, I felt like he stayed pretty. He did a good job of trying to disappear into the character for someone who has such a recognizable face.
That's fair.
I felt like he, and good for him for tackling that. And then
Josh Hartnett, I'd give a shout out to. It was really fun to see him in the movie again.
My buddy leaned over and was like, "Is that Josh Hartnett?" I was like, "That is Josh Hartnett."
I know.
Dean Cain.
Yeah.
This combined with his big role in the first episode of the new Black Mirror season, he's definitely putting himself out there and going for the drama.
Back to it. Yeah.
And good for him.
I did love that there was a little Josh Peck cameo there's just a couple random people in here. I was like, oh, that guy's in this. Okay. Like, all right.
Mm-hmm.
I rolled my eyes so hard when Gary Oldman showed up as President Truman.
Me too. And he's such a dick.
That was funny, kind of like just in the way that it was portrayed. I was like, "Oh man, he's an asshole."
Yeah,
and I have no idea how accurate that is or not, but it was just very strange to see. I like to myself as like Oppenheimer's approaching the Oval Office. I didn't know that Gary Oldman was in this movie.
Same.
And I just as he's approaching that office door, I thought I swear to God, if this is Gary Oldman as President Truman. And then they opened the door and Dylan and I just turned to each other and started laughing.
Yeah, I started laughing. I was like, Nate's gonna love this. Like, that's all I could think. I was like, fucking Gary Oldman, of course.
Classic Gary Oldman.
I know. All right, you guys ready to jump into the stars?
Yep, let's do it.
Yeah.
All right, we will be right back with our star rating. All right. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
All right.
I am giving this a solid 4 stars. I think this is a great movie. Maybe there's just, when we went over our most anticipated movies list at the beginning of this year, this was very much near the top, especially for me and Adam. Nate was dubious on it for the Christopher Nolan connection, but and so maybe I don't know what I was expecting. Some of the courtroom stuff kind of threw me, and then kind of just leading up at the first half of the movie, Florence Pugh is there, but she's not there very much. And I wasn't sure how I felt about how Emily Blunt's character was handled, in the back half. There were just some things where I walked out being like, that definitely, I liked it. And it is 1,000% piqued my interest in this whole thing. And I want to see it again. But it wasn't what I was expecting, so I just kind of got to chew on it for a while. So I'm still kind of at that stage. I do want to see this again in the theater, to your point, Nate, on an even bigger screen if I can. And I expect that on rewatch this will go up. But for right now, it's a great movie, 4 stars. I really, really liked it. Just maybe not what I expected.
All right. Well, I'll go next.
Mm-hmm.
I am giving this 4.5 stars. This is one of my favorite movies of the year. And maybe the difference is just kind of the expectations game of I go into every Nolan movie a little guarded. And the fact that I was just like drawn in from the first minute to the last minute. And really, I think what kind of cemented it for me was just how good the ending is.
Yeah.
Like, even when you get to that part where you think like, oh, how much of this movie is really left? Is the rest of it really just going to be this? It just wraps up so well. Like, all of that stuff is done so well, despite kind of being a little jarring at first. Yep. And that's also just why I think I'll like it even more on a rewatch, because I do know what to expect and it is so well done. So just kind of that whole element of like not knowing where it's going is gone. Like, I'm not going to be surprised by the direction the story goes. And I'm just excited to kind of revisit this moment in history, particularly, like I mentioned, like kind of all the stuff around the Manhattan Project. That's the stuff where I felt like I was really, really interested.
That's interesting. When we walked out, just based on kind of your reaction and kind of, I would have thought coming into this that you would have said that I didn't think you were going to like it this much. So I'm pleasantly surprised.
I thought
you would have said that the stuff outside the Manhattan Project wasn't handled very well, in your opinion.
No, I wanted to restrain my excitement for the episode. I didn't want to tip my hand too early.
For sure.
That's fair.
Over to Adam.
Also had to think about it for like a couple hours.
Yeah. I am also going to give this a 4.5. I think the largest impact this movie had for me was middle of the movie. I was overcome with that feeling of like, somebody discovered this, like, not so much like, obviously we're all, like roughly 30 years old. This was built in the 40s, so long before our time. We've just kind of accepted it because it's always been around. It's always been something that's been here. And it's really very recent in human history that like we have this kind of power. And that somebody had to like go in and do science and figure out like what does what and how this reaction and just, it's such a monumental discovery. And I really had the gravity of that discovery kind of imposing on my brain during the watch of this. And then couple that with obviously performances and like the rest of the story around the guy and the team who made it all possible. And to see the other scientists in other countries kind of going through the same stuff, or they took a wrong turn here, they only have partial information there. Seeing kind of that arms race of things was so interesting. And again, like this large cast with the incredible performances, especially from Cillian Murphy. I just think it's the best of the year, or one of the top 3. So I'm recommending this to everybody.
Yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites. Before we wrap up, because I did watch those 2 documentaries, I have to hit y'all with some little tidbits because I won't get another chance. So they definitely could have focused on this more, but they just mentioned it. But the Army basically built this huge factory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to start making like uranium. I think in 1939, because they knew that it would be needed. And then they also built another massive like plant in Washington where they had these insanely big machines that ran 24/7, and it would produce 10 grams of plutonium a day. And at one point they had like 1,100 of these machines built, and all of them lined up in a row. It was like the facility. It was like the biggest structure like in America or maybe in the world. Like at the time, like they just built it and they just plant. And that was just to crank out 10 grams of plutonium a day.
That was in DC.
What? No, in the state of Washington. It was
okay. I was like DC. That's a great idea.
Yeah. And then
like we already put the Pentagon there. Like
Oak Ridge, Tennessee, because they kept expanding and needing more and more, became by the end the 5th largest city in Tennessee, and it was completely just this project. It was every single employee. They employed at 70,000 people at one point.
Damn. When the Army needs something, they throw they throw everything at it, like get it done.
And workers were just told like, don't really, be evasive about what you do, don't answer questions, make jokes about it, but like keep everything on the down low, like just crazy wartime stuff. And then last thing I'll hit you with is the energy consumption was so insane to basically constantly be cranking out uranium and plutonium and all this shit that at one point like the three facilities, the one in Oak Ridge, the one in the state of Washington, and then Los Alamos, were consuming around 10% of the entire power grid of the United States. I mean, this was like the early 40s, so the power grid wasn't what it is today. But just think about that.
10% is 10%.
10% of all of our energy was going to this secret project. Like, wild stuff.
Unbelievable.
All right. Well, there you have it. Some fun little tidbits at the end of the Oppenheimer review.
I also realized there's a movie from the late 80s or early 90s, Fat Man and Little Boy. Which
I just heard about that today.
About this, it doesn't have great reviews. I might still watch it just to scratch the itch of
because Paul Newman's in it.
Paul Newman, yeah, I think John Cusack is in it.
Yeah,
but yeah, so we'll see about that. But no, this was great. It's fun, and yeah, I think we would all recommend everyone go see Oppenheimer if you haven't already.
Absolutely,
as screen as possible.
Absolutely.
All right. Is that
Dylan? I think it's your turn to put a wrap in the show.
All right. Mr. President, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed tops, depending on the breaks.